Hey, so I want to talk about the issue of compassion in society. Now, for this video, I'm going to be particularly focusing on my country, on the UK, because obviously it's what I'm more familiar with. And I want to be talking about this in the context of certain political initiatives, but also how it contrasts with the notion of nanny statism and political correctness and those sort of contentious issues. Because I believe it is possible to believe in a compassionate society or the need for a compassionate society whilst also rejecting oversensitivity. So I want to try and explain what I mean by this. Firstly, on initiatives, the most recent has come from the Prime Minister. Theresa May has spoken of the need of a shared society. Prime Minister's questions earlier today, Jeremy Corbyn made quite a vocal attack on her over the NHS, which has been described by the Royal College of Nurses and other sources as being in a crisis state at the moment. And he blamed that on Tory cuts to the number of healthcare professionals. On this one, I think Mr. Corbyn may have had some fair points, because Tories have been cutting in public services. But anyway, not wishing to get too partisan. So there's a shared society that Theresa May has proposed, and to her credit, she is talking of the need to be compassionate towards mental health issues. That's something the Lib Dems, to their credit, spoke about under Nick Clegg and more recently under Tim Farron. The big society was, of course, something that David Cameron brought up. I imagine he was sort of at least semi-thinking of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the US. The problem with the big society was it was coming at a time of heavy Tory cuts, so it just looked like a complete contradiction to, on one hand, be cutting public services, which were impacting some of society's most vulnerable, while saying we're all in it together. I still believe that was... and this is perhaps my bias coming in, but I still believe that was a big contradiction. There's One Nation Labour. There's political slogans going way, way back. This is just recent ones, to kind of amalgamate responsibility with compassion. Now, on the surface, I have no problem with that. I think it's a very good principle. But of course, the issue is in how it is done. But I don't want to stick too much with party politics with this one. I want to talk just about the general idea of it. I think a progressive society and a strong society, and we can extend that to saying a strong country, shouldn't just be measured by how strong its military is, how big its GDP is, or its influence in the world. Now, the UK still remains quite an influential country, I would say, even post-Brexit. We remain on the UN Security Council. We're a nuclear power. We continue to have very large cultural influence, etc. But all those things are fine. But I think a nation also needs to have social progress, because there's not much point of being a nuclear power and having a large economy if there are, for example, elderly people abandoned in hospitals, or if there are homeless people having their blankets taken away from them, as was recently the case in Paris, which in my opinion is a complete disgrace. Apparently Parisian police were taking the blankets away from the homeless. Now, maybe we need to look more into that, but I can't think of any logical way to justify that. So it has to be how society treats its most vulnerable. I do passionately believe in that, and I don't think it makes you a socialist to argue that it is unacceptable that the wealth-poverty gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I don't necessarily go along with socialist thinking, because I think socialism is too much anti-wealth. Nevertheless, nor am I of neo-capitalist thinking, that is to say that there should be absolutely no limit. And this idea that it should be trickle-down economics whereby, oh, well, everyone will do well if the super rich get even richer. I don't accept that. I'm not an expert in economics, but to me that's just doesn't add up. So it's easy to say that, oh, let's be a progressive society. And I mean progressive here in the adjective sense, not so much the political sense, because progressive has become a political thing. It's become like a way to kind of tap into ideology. When I say progressive, I mean literally the adjective progressive, something progressing forward. Um, and for me, that isn't necessarily a left or right wing issue. It's just an issue of common sense decency. I think one problem is that there is this idea or this sort of tendency to associate progress in society with political correctness or the nanny state. And I think part of the problem is, firstly, that I don't think the regressive left have helped because they've shown themselves, and I'm not attacking any individual here, I'm just talking about the movement, the ideology in general. They've shown themselves to be hypocrites by, for example, talking about women's rights and gay rights on one hand, whilst turning a blind eye to fanatical Islamism on another. There's nothing compassionate about that. There's nothing peaceful about that. There is everything stupid about that and apathetic. So for me, being compassionate isn't about being flowery and singing kumbaya and everyone gets on. A compassionate leader is also a wise leader and can also be hard headed. I don't think it's a contradiction for a leader to be tough skinned and hard headed whilst also being compassionate. Because they may need to be hard headed when it comes to taking on extremism, and yet they're doing that arguably out of compassion. Well, firstly, out of a sense of responsibility, because that's their job, um, but also arguably out of compassion, because we look at, for example, the hideous, barbaric things that these Islamist groups do, and it is a sense of outrage that then drives a sense of compassion. And very often, this is an interesting phenomenon, very often anger is directly related to a sense of compassion. I mean, if we read in the newspaper about a vulnerable person being attacked by a gang, most people, whether they're left wing or right wing, are going to feel either a great sense of discomfort or a great sense of anger, maybe a bit of both. I know I would certainly feel both. So it's what I call empathetic anger. That is to say, it's anger not because people enjoy being angry, but because they have compassion and sympathy for the victim. And this to me indicates that most people, it's actually an optimistic thing because it indicates that most people have a sense of basic decency. So people might disagree on the exact politics. People might be more veering towards the left or more veering towards the right. But I think when it comes down to it, there is certain basic rights and wrongs that most people can agree on. Now, most people are going to agree it is wrong to assault someone for no reason. Most people are going to agree that it's unacceptable in any society that people are left to be homeless in the cold. People might disagree on the exact approach, but they would agree that that's a social ill. So, for that reason, I do have time for bipartisan work. And it's one thing that irritates me about this country sometimes. People have this hostility to bipartisanism. We saw that when Nick Clegg entered into the coalition government in 2010. Why is that? Why is someone selling their soul if they're prepared to talk to the other side? That's ridiculous. Surely that shows maturity and putting the country before party. That's not to say that people shouldn't have passionate debates and shouldn't disagree. But why do we have this idea in the UK that it should always be a case of arguing for the sake of arguing? Where people find common ground, perhaps I'm sidetracking a little bit here, but I do think it's important. Where there is common ground, that's a good thing. Um, And what I find irritating is that proponents of political correctness and proponents of, for example, this culture in modern universities, in a lot of modern British universities, you have like safe spaces, no platforming, and so on. The argument for that is that it's about tolerance and compassion. In fact, it is the exact opposite. And I do believe it needs to be challenged because we are seeing this sort of neoliberal intolerance, actually. It's not even far left because these people aren't necessarily communists and neo socialists. Very often, they come from a place of regressive left wing thinking that isn't necessarily communist. Because the thing about communism, I mean, I detest communism, don't get me wrong, but I think communists at least are honest with themselves. They know what they want and they're consistent. I think they're wrong on many issues, but at least they're consistent, generally speaking. With the regressive left, neoliberalism, in the sense of this sort of snooty sense of being progressive, I find that it preaches tolerance and yet very intolerant. What I meant, by the way, by communism is that communists don't generally preach tolerance. They preach what they preach, and I detest communism, but it is what it is. With this attitude, with the regressive left, they preach about tolerance, and yet they show very, very little. In my opinion, a compassionate society doesn't need to be a dishonest society. A compassionate society isn't about saying, we're just going to say whatever pleases people. So, yeah, sometimes people do need to hear uncomfortable truths in order for a greater outcome. So, let's say, for instance, um, in a particular city, the data shows, this is just a scenario, let's say in a particular city, the data shows that crime is being disproportionately committed by a certain ethnic group. Now, the politically correct school of thought would be, oh, don't talk about that, that's racism, because it's stigmatizing people. But the honest approach would be, well, there is something going on here. We need to address the problem. We need to understand why it is that this particular community is more impacted by this crime issue. And it doesn't mean the whole community, but it means that there is something going on here. And actually, the latter approach to me is more compassionate because it is trying to get the solution. Whereas the former approach is just trying to sweep the problem under the carpet. And that's not actually compassionate for anyone. So I suppose in this regard, I can't believe I'm going to say this, but I suppose in some ways I would go more along the conservative lines of thinking because I do think the Tories, in some ways, they have it right with this. And I'm not for a second saying they're a compassionate party. I believe there's many things they do are anything but compassionate. For example, I believe some of the welfare approaches are appalling. Work capability assessments and all the rest of it. I'm not a Tory. I'm not a fan of everything they do. But I do think that combining the notion of compassion with responsibility and with honesty is it's something I tend to associate in my mind with conservative thinking, and it's something I agree with. It's just that I don't agree with the particular policies that they put forward. Um, I can't believe I've just said that because, you're looking at someone who has often despised what the Conservative Party does. I don't sit on the fence about this. So, in conclusion, we have to understand that compassion isn't about wrapping everyone in cotton wool. It's not about saying, oh, let's just tell people what they want to hear. Sometimes compassion is about looking at a problem and being honest about it. And saying, yeah, there is an issue going on here. We need to address it this way. We need to address the root causes of this problem. And sometimes that means just telling it like it is, whether people want to hear it or not. And I'm not, by the way, saying people should just be provocative for the sake of it, or there should be crass slogans to win votes. Nothing like that. because I am against that approach. So, for instance, I detested the way the Tories had like we'll make work shy work and all this sort of stuff. That's pure tabloid bait, and I detest it. But likewise, it's a left wing equivalent when certain left wingers will brand anyone who disagrees with them as racist or sexist or any of the other nonsense. Shouting people down in a debate is not open minded, it's childish and it's pathetic. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. I hope this video makes sense because I have raised a number of different issues. But basically, what I'm saying is that honesty is a very, very, very important thing. That doesn't mean that honesty has to be crass. So it doesn't mean just insulting someone for the sake of it. But by the same token, political correctness is not about politeness, in my opinion. It's to do with censorship and it's to do with controlling how people think. And okay, there will be some unpleasant people who use it as an excuse just to be assholes, let's face it. But I think those people can be called out without endorsing this culture of overt sensitivity. And I think the approach that a lot of universities are going down of all this safe spacing and to me that is very, very nauseating. It's creating an intolerant environment, actually. So let me know your thoughts, and thank you for watching. Compassion with honesty.